And voila. Hello, everyone. My name is Julayne Isaac. I also write as EC Ambrose, and I'll be your moderator this evening for the panel on making painful edits. We have a fantastic cast of characters here to join you, and I'll let them introduce themselves in just a moment. A couple of housekeeping issues first. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little bubble that says chat. If you want to hang out, make comments, you can put those over there. It's especially useful if we mention a book title or an author name that you want to capture or that you missed. That is a great place to contain that information. If you would like to ask a question that you want the panel to address when we get to the Q&A part, please put that in the Q&A. That should be the little double bubble down there, and about halfway through, so at about 8:30 Eastern time, I will start taking some of those questions out of Q&A to be addressed by our panelists. So again, comments toward the chat, questions for the panelists to the Q&A. So we're going to begin with the panelist introductions. And Julayne, would you like to lead off?
I certainly can. I'm Julayne Hughes. I have been a freelance writer and editor for over 25 years. My short stories have been published in several anthologies and podcasts. I've edited in a whole bunch of different genres for small publishers and independent authors alike. You can find me at julayne.net in case you care.
Great. Kim, over to you.
Okay, let me click this for the chat. There we go. I'm Kim Hargan. I am retired professional alien. By that I mean I served the American people for 28 years as a diplomat, and so as a U.S. citizen, wherever the U.S. government sent me, I was an alien in those countries, there professionally, but I am retired now, so yes, I'm a retired professional alien. I've recently, since retiring, begun writing fiction again. Most of my 28 years, I was writing speeches for ambassadors and giving press conferences, press interviews in, things like Danish or Mandarin Chinese, or Armenian or Russian. Yeah, as a writer, I find that I do have to make edits.
Great. Wen, how about you?
Hi, I'm Wen Spencer. I'm the guest of honor this year. Here's one of my books. This was actually a reprint, so that they gave me a chance to run through and change little mistakes I had made. I really, really love that. And I'm a very messy writer, so I throw away vast amounts of things. I think my record is probably the book project I'm working on right now, where I'm like on the third sweep and probably have been writing for 2 or 3 years on this, and I am throwing away about $500,000 on this. But it's not the first time. Endless Blue had 5 beginnings that I threw away, each at 50,000 words a shot. I'm really messy. I really wish I could solve this problem, but I've gotten very good at dealing with cutting things and throwing away.
Nick, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nick Martell. This is my debut book. It's called The Kingdom of Liars. Comes out June 23rd by Saga Press. And as I've learned, I am also a very messy writer. My debut, I cut like 100,000 words from it initially, and then rewrote parts of it. My sequel, I cut, I think, 50 or 60,000. I'm really hoping for my third, I don't cut, maybe I cut like only 10,000, but it's not looking that way.
Good luck on that. So as I said, I'm Julayne Isaac, also known as EC Ambrose, and I'm going to go over here in the chat and see if I can drop some info. I wrote the Dark Apostle series, dark historical fantasy about medieval surgery. It is complete in 5 volumes for your binge reading pleasure. And I do have a spot over in the vendors area if you want to come by and chat and ask questions about that. I'll also be doing a reading related to that tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock alongside another debut author. I'll be excited to hear more from him. I also write fantasy novels, which is probably where my focus is going to be because that was my most painful edit. And interestingly, I have perhaps started out as a messy writer and become extraordinarily organized. So I'm definitely an outliner and a scrivener junkie and all of those sort of structural things, which is not really the purview of this panel, alas, but feel free to ask me about that later on. Also, after the panel ends here, we are planning on going over, and some of us will get to hang out for a while on the Discord channel, which is for writing and fiction panels or to discuss afterwards. So that'll be a place you can find us to carry on the conversation if we don't get through everything here, which we probably won't. We'll need to make some edits. So the first question is, what's the most painful cut that you've had to make and how did you handle it? And Nick, it sounds like you've gone through this process pretty recently, debut novel coming out, so maybe you can get us started on this question.
Yeah, so the probably most painful edit I made was for my debut. I cut 100,000 words, and it all needed to be cut. It was terrible. Like every single one of the words was just downright terrible. But it was one of those things I didn't really know I needed to do until someone was like, no, this isn't good. There's some good parts here, but this huge chunk is really slow and boring. And you know, when you hear those things like, oh, this part's slow, you have that sometimes have the initial be like, oh, well, maybe you're just wrong, but like, no, I think that part is slow. And cutting all those words allowed me to focus in on what the novel was about and really highlight those aspects and bring out even the better parts of it. But you know, cutting 100,000 words kind of like slapping yourself in the face a few times where like you see the word count go down, you're like, oh, it hurts over and over again. But it was probably the best thing I did for my novel. And I don't regret it. I hated it at the time, but it's made the novel a lot better.
So these were edits that you made under editorial direction when you submitted the book?
No, this was before I actually even got an agent.
Okay.
My agent was kind of like, this part's bad. And then he ended up signing me after I did the revisions. But it was like consolidating characters, consolidating plot lines, making the setting more interesting. It was everything they kind of say, you got to do all these things. And I pretty much did every single one of them to make the book more concise.
Great. Julayne, how about you?
Well, I've kind of seen it from both sides as an editor and a writer. As a writer, my most painful edit probably was the first story I got published in an online magazine. Oh gosh, 10 or 12 years ago. I don't remember how long. But there was this nice, big, long descriptive section about, you know, thus and so, that for a short story, I'm not going to be able to say that I cut 10,000 words because the story itself wasn't even hardly that long. But that one section was my baby. It was so beautiful, but it did not push the plot along. It was just a bunch of, oh, hey, look at me, you know, and it had to go. And that just, oh, I still remember how that felt. You're just a punch in the stomach. But on the editing side, I have been the bearer of the bad news to certain authors that, you know, you might not want to hear this, but I think this entire chapter has to go. And then I have to have my list of reasons as to why it has to go, and in such a way that the author then says, well, yeah, I don't know why I didn't think of that before. So yeah, on both sides, it's painful on both sides, really.
I'm not sure how other authors take it, but generally when I get news like that, I'm like, just hold on a moment. And then I like walk away like,
Yep, that's about it.
Yep. Stomp around the house for a while. I strongly prefer to get it by email than on the phone because I don't want a live body to be on the other end of that. Yeah. So Wen, do you want to? You want to jump in with your most painful edit story?
My most painful edit was I was under contract. So, you know, deadline is given and time is clicking away. And I sat down and wrote the first 50,000 words for Endless Blue, and the main character was a slave on a ship. And I got to the end of 50,000 words and realized the slave has no agency. She can't decide diddly squat. So I backed the whole way up and changed it so that she was a freelance translator. And she was just working on this ship and wrote the 50,000. Got to use a lot of what I had, but you know, since the situations had drastically changed for her, then I realized when she's on a boat, she can't leave because they're in the middle of the ocean. So I back up again, and I gave her her own boat, but she was working with somebody who was on another boat. She had to come up with a reason to leave the area to go do what I wanted her to do, which would advance the plot. And I got to the end of the 50,000 words and went, no, threw all that away. And said, yes, she's on her own boat. She has nobody else that she's working about. And if she wants to go over there, she can.
She's bloody well going over there.
But I swore I'd never do boats again. And I broke my vow, and the project I'm working on now that I keep on getting stuck on is pirates on airships. And it's the same problem. People have to have a good reason to go someplace. It's not like the villain can walk into the office of downtown New York and go, moo ha 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 ha. I just wanted to stand here and tell you my reasoning. Okay, bye. If the villain shows up, he's going to do something after sailing all that distance.
So it sounds like you're using those openings as part of your development process for coming to understand what the book is about and what the book needs.
Well, I have a very loose plot line, and when I sit down and write the loose plot line, it makes sense. But when I get down to the sense and structure of this is what the character is thinking as he makes the decision to do X, if that thought process is not logical, I hit a wall. It has to be illogical to me for the story to proceed. And I kept on not giving enough agency to the character to be able to logically say, all right, to solve this problem, I need to go over here, and I need a boat to do that, and I can take a boat there, which required her to have a boat and that she had full command of that boat.
Sounds like a good transition. Kim, how about you? Most painful edit story, and how did you handle it?
Okay, so life happened, and I got my bachelor's degree in December rather than in the spring. But I got a fellowship for graduates, full ride fellowship at State University of New York in Albany. That started in September. So, and I had a wife and a toddler to look after. So we went off to to Albany, New York, and I got a job at the phone company as a security guard. And I was security guard at the loading dock. And my job was when somebody made a delivery to push the button and the big doors would roll up. And then I push another button and the big doors would roll down and I call somebody, they come pick it up. So 4 to 7 hours a day to myself in that little office, hey, I brought paper and pens and started writing. And I wrote some stories, I did some outlines, some others, I got partway through some. And then graduate school started, and after graduate school, I went on to become a diplomat, and long time not writing. And then back in the US, I was not dealing with foreign languages anymore, I started writing again. And I dig out my files and I look at some of these old stories and finish them, work my way through. One of the stories was to be the opener for in the future science fictional magical realism. And we'll get to how that was going to happen. But it was, I had conceived it in novella length, but I conceived it in 4 acts. And the concept was somewhere out there, some alien race, some guru had achieved transcendence and had gone to the next level of existence and started inviting people to go with him. And while he was going, while the people were going, another alien race found them, started going, took it back to their planet, And you get this chain reaction, you get the Fermi problem where, why is there nobody out there? It's because they've all gone to the next level. So humanity goes out to space and they're finding the empty planets, capital E, capital P. The great question, some of the planets are, ancient Egypt type ruins. Some of them, nobody turned off the power plant, so you can go into a room, flick a switch, and the lights come on, but there's nobody home. And so the story starts with humanity's first contact with one of these races that's at the tail end of disappearing. And each of the 4 acts involved a different group of people, and each of them had its own introductory paragraph. And so the introductory paragraph of the first one describes the crew of the exploration ship as intrepid because they're explorers. Beginning of second act, the scientists bring an actual apartment block, they can live in, and they've got offices and a cafeteria, and they drop it there. And I describe the passengers as being rational and logical and inquiring minds because they're scientists. Third act opens with a paragraph. The passengers of this ship were devout and pious because they've all come for the revelation of the transcendence. They're all religious people. And the opening paragraph of the fourth is that the sole proprietor, crew, owner of this ship is a rapscallion scalawag, whatnot, because essentially he's a looter. He sneaks onto empty planets and gets good stuff to bring back and sell to customers back on Earth. They're collectors. And so I had written the first, way back when I was a security guard, I'd written the first 2 acts and the opening paragraph to the third act, and then graduate school and all the rest of life. So now I'm looking at this thing, and it's not going anywhere. Okay, I've got that third paragraph, and I've got the third act where, let's see, in the first act, a couple of crew members transcend, and the ship that one guy stays behind. He's convinced he can get them to come back, and the ship goes back to report to Earth. Second act, the scientists come down, and they start to disappear in groups, and the rest of them go back and report. In the third act, all of the clerics transcend, and after 40 nights of radio silence, the ship that's in orbit goes back. The clerics have been using the apartment block that had been left behind by the scientists. Mm-hmm. And in the fourth act, this scallywag meets one of these clerics, and who is almost 95% transcended. He's just a voice that you can hear from around the door inviting you to go with him, but you never actually see him. And there's the young, beautiful anthropologist who stayed with the crew guy from the second act. So I'm going, okay, I need to populate this third act. I need people of made up future splinter sects and schisms and all of that. And I need to have them have dialogue, and I have to have them have, talk about points of doctrine. And let me work on this one over here some more. And I'll think about it. And I got back to it. And at some point, it occurred to me, I had 4 acts, but I was in drama in high school and in some stuff in college as well. And I thought, most modern plays that put on the stage have 3 acts. The opener, the development, and then the climax where all the tensions come to a head. And I got, what if I made this only 3 acts? And I thought about that. Got it. All 3 things happened. All 3 events happened before the scallywag shows up. But he's set onto the planet by a collector friend of his, and he thinks it's just a myth. But the collector's, no, I'll send you the reports. And he sends him the reports on all 3 events. And so he goes through them, and that's how he knows that the events occurred, including Act 3, which has now happened off stage. And a few other salient points come up in the conversation with this cleric. And so the third act happened, but I didn't write it. It was gone.
So you ended up with 3 acts.
3 acts.
Is this now published? Is this out there in the world?
I've submitted it once or twice.
Okay.
Haven't put it in. The next story, again, this is supposed to kick off the story. The next story, set in future San Francisco, just wrote itself immediately after that. But it was that was a roadblock, an entire quarter of the story that I threw out. Because it was blocking. Everybody knows what BS is, right? MS is more of the same, and PhD is piled higher and deeper. And thinking about what I did to that story for this panel, I realized that I had shown what was going on in the first 2 chapters, and for acts, and in the second act, we saw it accelerating. Why did I need to subject the reader to more acceleration when they could tell what was happening. All I had to do was talk about it afterwards, after the fact, in those dialogues, and
Problem
what was
solved.
the point of not only subjecting myself to writing all that, but subjecting the reader to that. Somebody, and I think they were quoting Heinlein in a panel that I attended some years ago, said a scene has to do one of three things. It has three purposes. To advance the plot, to develop the character, to impart vital information, and if it can do any two or all three of those, so much the better. If it can't, it really doesn't belong there. And I realize that third scene, it put the cleric there to talk to the scallywag in the fourth act. That was its
So,
entire
Kim,
purpose. To put that guy
I think
there.
we need to move on.
I'm just about done. It did not impart any new information, and it didn't do anything for characters, and so it had to go.
Those are some wise principles. So I'll give you the brief version of my story. When I sold my first novel, it was 220,000 words, the manuscript that I submitted, and the contract that I signed was for a published novel of 150,000 words. So if you do the math, that's 70,000 words less that the editor wanted. Yeah, so that was The Singer's Crown, my first novel. It was a painful edit because when you're cutting that number of words from a completed story arc, you're talking about subplots and characters. So going through the process of trimming out one of the major subplots helped me understand why it was there, what I was doing with it. It turned out that that character had actually undergone the hero's journey in sort of a very classic Joseph Campbell way. And it was extremely useful to me as a writer to have to do that work and deliberately think about what each scene was doing here. Do I need these? And then how do I bring it back together, having removed that material? So, but I definitely left a lot of things on the cutting room floor that I later on wished that I hadn't. So this past year, I was able to release The Singer's Crown, the author's cut. And I have a little glare on my screen here, but you can see this is the original. This is the author's cut. Yeah. I didn't bring back all 70,000 words because some of them were, some of them were redundant. The way that David Hartwell had put it when I was talking with him before I ended up selling the manuscript to someone else, was that I had extended my examples. As you say, once I've demonstrated how this works, I have shown this thing, I don't need to show the reader repeatedly the same kind of information. So trimming that back was definitely a key. So I wanted to, before we take questions, and if you do have questions, I see we have a couple of questions over in the Q&A at this point. So if you do have questions, you can put those over in the Q&A. One technique or tool that you use to analyze what needs to go or how to go about revising a work. Nick, maybe we can start with you again. Is that okay?
Yeah. So usually when I'm trying to figure out what I need to cut and what I don't need to cut, is usually if I get stopped, that's usually when I ran into a problem and I need to evaluate what happened. So to go back for my debut of those 100,000 word cut, all of it there was a magic school in it. And the magic school was something I'd grown up reading, where you think of all these great fantasy books. Oh, there's a magic school. There's always a magic school. And it was terrible. The entire thing was terrible. It was all the boring parts of school and none of the exciting parts. But when I was looking at it, I was able to realize that the magic system I had in my world was actually better without the school, because then the readers got to pick apart what was going on and why it was going on, rather than having all the answers pretty much shoved in their faces. So allowed the mystery and this world that was still coming together as the reader was figuring out on the page, rather than have all the answers. So me, it's when I get stuck. That's why I know I got to go back and cut something.
Great. Wen, do you have a particular tool or technique that you use to figure out what changes need to be made?
Well, I have discovered a lot is that, as I said, it needs to be logical that the character does what they're going to do, what I have planned done. And I've discovered that one of the things is that how much information the character has been given makes whether or not it's logical or not. Say if somebody's supposed to go to a party and they find out the person they want to see isn't there and the person they hate the most is going to be there, them going to the party doesn't make any sense. So, but if you take the information of who's going to be at the party away from them and leave them with the expectation that they'll see the person they want to see, them going to the party makes sense. And I often discover that if I back up in a scene or two, and sometimes 3 or 4, I find the piece of information that makes the character's choice that I want them to make illogical, and either take it away or lessen it some way, or actually like lie to them. And then later on they find out the truth, but it's all, a lot of my problems come from information flow. If you set up A plus B equals C, you and the characters and your readers are expecting you to continue on to D. And if you suddenly jump to Z, you're screwing everything up. So
looking at the logical connections between, especially motivation, it sounds like.
Yeah, and that's where I have problems plotting novels, is I can define this great big macro scale. It's the very micro scale, which actually matters hugely when you're talking about motivations.
Julayne, how about you? And you can look at this from either the writer or the editor perspective, because I know that you've done both, so maybe you have some advice on either side.
Well, as far as writing is concerned, I'm like Wen. I tend to be a very sloppy writer. And it's really funny when some of my editing clients actually get to watch me in action on a first draft of mine. Wow, Julayne, you really, yeah, I know. Just, this is why I'm an editor, so that I can get rid of most of this. But anyway, one of the things that I like to do, both as a self-editor of my own stuff and as an editor of other people's stuff, is kind of highlight the beats, so to speak. So it's almost like reverse outlining, I suppose you could call it. I hate working from an outline myself, but when I'm done, I know what needs to be said and how it needs to be said. So if that's there, good, that's there, good, that's there, good. And I don't have another beat for 20 pages, then guess what? Chances are something needs to go.
Yeah, when I get lost, I do find the sitting down and writing a synopsis of this is what I have and this is where I'm trying to get to. Kind of is sometimes a discussion to myself. Sometimes I post it to my Patreon. Hey guys, this is what's going on mentally with me. And that whole looking at the story structure at the big scale helps. So I end up writing lots and lots of synopsis.
Right, exactly.
Another thing that I
do
recommend the reverse outline.
I'm sorry, what was that, Elaine?
Chuck Wendig has a great book about sort of self-editing and the editorial process, and he recommends reverse outlining, which you had talked about. But go ahead, Julayne, what else?
I kind of use mechanical means sometimes. There are little editing softwares out there. One free one is called Edit Minion. And while that's better really for the copy edit, line edit sort of thing, it can be good for this kind of editing too, because I've discovered that if it notices that this particular phrase is repeated a lot, chances are there's some babies I need to kill.
That was Edit Minion?
Yeah, editminion.com.
Sounds good. Yeah, one of my tools, a little bit similar to what Wen was saying about, your sort of self-analysis, is what I now think of as the Sarah Connor analysis. And this was introduced to me via D.P. Lyle, who is a thriller writer and perhaps best known as a consulting doctor about how to kill people. He's a forensic scientist. So he did an analysis of the Terminator film, where he talked about, after each scene, is this good for Sarah Connor or bad for Sarah Connor? And most of the time, since I tend to be writing fast-paced, adventure-based fiction, I want it to be bad for Sarah Connor. So when I'm looking at that reverse outline or looking at my scene structure, because I do tend to outline in advance and to do a lot of brainstorming and sort of upfront work on the plot, I'll look at each of those scenes and say, is it getting better for my character or worse? What position are they in at the end of this scene? And most of the time, I want it to be getting worse, because that's how I know I'm escalating the conflict. Kim, do you want to make a brief remark on this? And then I do want to take some questions, because it is 8:30 and I said we would do that. So
at shorter lengths, I usually can hold the narrative in my head, and so I'm a pantser. At longer lengths, novella and longer, I like an outline, and sometimes a fairly detailed outline if I need to make sure the character gets there. And so when I'm writing, every so often, you know, working in chapters, and I'll be looking at the chapter and I'll look, is he headed where he needs to go to get to the end of the chapter to set up the next chapter? And sometimes I'll look at it and go, and I'm trying to inhabit the character like a good method actor, and trying to see, and as Wen said, you know, make logical choices based on the information he has. And if the direction he's going isn't going to take me to the end of the chapter that I need to get on to the next chapter, then I have to go back and wipe out several pages and start over again, because I'm going in the wrong direction.
mm-hmm. Okay, I do want to get to our audience members have been posting a couple of questions for us. Tippy had the first question for each of the authors. After you get sick of writing on a particular story, how long do you put it away before it's time to go back to it? And what affects that length of time that you leave the manuscript to sit?
Depends if you have a contract.
Yeah. Depends on the deadline.
Is a good point. Yep, if you're on deadline, that is definitely something that would affect it.
Yes, some of the reasons why I'm fairly good at coming up with ways to get painful evidence and everything is so many times I've been under deadline, and at that point you do whatever it takes. One of the times, I think it was Balticon, I was working on Endless Blue, I was stuck, and I wrote up all the characters' names and I put them in chairs in the ballrooms, and then I was moving the chairs around like, okay, he's on this boat and he's over here and he's over here, and why does he go over here? And somebody I've never met before was watching all this, and I'm thinking, she must think I'm insane. But no, I was just under deadline and I needed to figure it out. Yeah, and it's whatever works. And if it's not working, try something else and try something else and try something else.
Yeah, for me, it kind of depends on the story and the kind of story that I'm writing. There have been some stories that I wrote in a single day. I looked at it the next day and I sent it off. It was fine. There have been others that I haven't picked up again for months. And it's a darn good thing I did, because I needed that fresh set of eyes for that sucky story.
Yeah, I'm principally a novelist, so when I have completed my draft of the novel, then I tend to put it aside and let it rest for about a month or so. It depends a little bit on what my workflow is. If I have another revision that's coming in, then I might complete the revision and then turn back to the new project and do a complete reread of it for myself before I would make some revisions and send it out to beta readers. So for me, it's usually a month or two on a novel length project.
Yeah, you can.
Nick or Kim, you guys let your manuscripts rest?
At times, you know, sometimes you make yourself disciplined and sit down and grind out enough to realize you're not making progress. And then sometimes what it takes is, you know, let your subconscious chew over it, and then something will come along in the news, you know, or you'll read something and you go, that's what I was missing. I didn't know about that sort of thing, and now that gives me, and then bang, you know, then you're ready to, then it starts flowing out again. It breaks the block in the dam. Yeah, there we go. Breaks the dam that was blocking the flow of ideas and words.
Right.
Yeah, Elaine, you pretty much said exactly what I do. I'm in like a steady rhythm of like, I send a book in, someone's talking about it, I go back onto the next project, maybe let's set it for a month. When the stuff comes back in, I look at it again, and like deadline doesn't give me much time to like sit these novels sit for too long. but right now I'm in this like a steady rhythm. Like max a month is usually what I take between while I'm working on something else and I'm waiting for feedback from someone to come in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to jump a little bit ahead in the Q&A because this is one of the things that we had talked about a little bit in the green room before we showed up that we wanted to address. Missy says, my weak point is how do you reconnect any threads that run through the parts that you're removing? How do you keep track of the threads and make sure that nothing important gets left out?
I'd like to say the first thing you do is you make a complete copy of the manuscript before you start changing stuff. And you save it someplace else, and that way you can go in and make a total mess of things and still have something to fall back on if you totally screwed it up. That's probably one of the big ones. And then if you're going to make a change, start where the change comes in and then work forward to that way. Because if you like have a character where, oh, you decided that he's showing up at night instead of dawn, there's going to be things all through that mentions the time of day, and you have to catch all of them. Or if you want to insert a gun, but he gets naked in the next chapter, where did the gun go? You know, and it's a lot of little things. So you have to work from the point that you make the change to the place where you stop writing, to make sure you catch all the little ripples that a change will make. And some of them are just, you know, small, and sometimes it's huge.
One of the big things for me is keeping track of the emotional tenor as you enter and exit a scene, because if you remove a scene in the middle, you remove that, you know, those extra chapters. Often the material that you have removed had some emotional content for the character. So maybe they left angry from the party and then they entered the next scene angry, but now you've cut the party scene. You need to make sure that in the scene that follows, their emotion is now appropriate for the scene that is connecting with it. And that can be, yeah, one of those little fiddly bits where you have to sort of go through and polish the point of view and make sure that you're carrying forward a consistent emotional journey for the character. Kim, looked like you had something to say.
If you've got the time, once you've written your way all the way through it, set it aside and work on other stuff and kind of sort of forget what you wrote, and then go back as your own beta reader. And you go, you know, where did the gun go? You know, and then once you've done that and fixed what you can, then you actually take it to a beta reader. The beta reader who's never seen it before is going to be reading along and kind of go, you know, and I've got that from readers where it was in my brain, I visualized it, I understood it perfectly, it flowed in my brain. What I put down on the page didn't capture all of that. And the beta reader reads along and goes, where did this jump come from? You know, why does he enter the scene angry? You know, you didn't talk about the party. You know, and the beta reader makes your comment, and you look at it with a fresh perspective, because somebody else has now commented on it, and you look and you go, oh yeah, I did leave that out.
I post a lot.
Beta readers help a lot with that.
Yeah, I post a lot on my Patreon page because I'm working on book 6 of the series, and I have a lot of, did I say how old she was? Did I ever mention his Keller Vise? Did I ever do this? Did I ever set this up? Where, you know, I basically have lost track of information, because Tinker was written in 2003, well, published in 2003. It was actually written in 2000. So it's 20 years ago that I wrote the original book. So there's a lot of, I don't think I've done this, but, you know, maybe I'm just forgetting. So I do a lot of
crowdsource your continuity.
Crowdsource continuity, because, oh my God, this new book has 8 point of views, and they all have been in different books at different times, and trying to get it all to mesh up is sometimes maddening.
Julayne or Nick, did you have a suggestion for how to keep track of the threads?
Yeah, I can go. So I said my debut, I had a magic school and I cut it out. I'm a messy writer. I'm also a lazy writer. So I left it in as kind of world building that there once was this magic school, and some of my characters talk about it, be like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could go to this place? So I was allowed to connect threads of like, oh, they're still talking about this thing that I had all this information on, got to leave a bits of this world building I had done. And what I found is it really like was able to like enrich the world a little bit, because you have these characters talking about something that's already been past and long gone, and they're like, we wish we had this, we wanted to have this, but we didn't. So it also lets me have like a few bones of this thing laying around. Also, my entire magic system essentially is plot hole, a giant plot hole fixer. It's based on like people losing memories. So any mistake I make in the text, I just have to correct in the next book. Be like, it wasn't a mistake; it was a plot the entire time.
Nick is brilliant, brilliant.
I was so proud of that when I came up with it, because everyone's like, "Oh, Max is cool," and in the head I'm like, "This is just me being a lazier writer."
Well, being a lazy writer kind of goes into one of the things that I like to do, and this is where letting a manuscript age can really help you out. Because if you go and do a bunch of edits and then just put it aside for a while, and then when you come back to it, then it's a lot easier to see where some of those loose threads might be.
One of the weird mind tricks that I've picked up is you change it into a different font than what you usually use. If you go from like Times Roman to Arial, just for editing purposes, something about seeing it in a different font than what you're used to, you see it differently, and it's easier to pick up mistakes. Of course, you flop back to the font that you're going to submit to, but in the meantime, you can have this mind jar.
Something similar is you can either read it out loud to yourself or have it read to you. There is a lovely text-to-speech reader out there that I know of called naturalreader.com. There may be some others that maybe you guys know of, but that is something that can really help you see things a little bit differently.
That's actually a great segue. We had two questions in our Q&A that we're looking for specific tools, i.e. software or programs that you use in your editorial or organizational process to make your life easier. So I'm a big Scrivener person, and I use a lot of spreadsheets. So I'm trying to make sure that I track a lot of my information in the spreadsheets. And sometimes that relates to plot things like obviously my outline might be in the spreadsheet and then gets transferred into the Scrivener file. And also the, sorry, I got distracted by the chat for a minute there, but they're handling it. It'll be good. And I use my spreadsheet, obviously, to manage things like names, character roles. One of my novels, the character is a Mongolian scout and has 5 different horses. So I wanted to make sure I kept track of his horses' names, because even though they're not important for much of the story, they're very important to that particular character.
And your fans will tell you if you get it wrong.
Yes. No. In book 3, you said that the third horse's name was... Thank you, fans. So other tools that people use.
I work with fountain pen and paper, and then I edit and organize as I type it up. You know, and I got, okay, this idea I had 3 days later, but it actually belongs, you know, number 2 instead of number 15. And then I rework it as I'm typing it up, and then I'll make notations in my planning as that goes along. And every so often, I'll do a re-edit of the outline and the information, you know, my world building, so I have it on hand. But it's simple word processing.
I tend to use a lot of pen and paper for my own mental things, because like I'll even use paper, you know, like 17 by 14 and 5 different colors of pens. but I also make sure that if I finally, and I have a lot of, no, that's stupid, don't do that, written onto those things. So it's me talking to myself with pens and paper. But once I figure it out, I type it up into a synopsis. So it's there and it's in the computer and it's easy to access.
Yes.
So it sounds like we don't necessarily have specific software or apps that people are using.
I tried Scrivener and I couldn't wrap my brain around how to work it with my style of writing. I really wanted it to work, but I'm just too messy for it. And that says a lot. Too messy for Scrivener.
So we have just 5 minutes left. Do you think we can do a quickie? We have one more question in the chat or in the Q&A, so it would be nice if we could, we'll stay concise. Have you had a character tell you a minor character wasn't, or an editor rather, tell you a minor character wasn't necessary? For me, this usually comes in the form of these 2 or 3 characters are serving similar functions. They could be the same person. Just streamline it, pull a couple of those characters, and link those aspects of the story together into one. So minor characters, what do you think?
Yeah, I had that happen with me where I had actually written an entire young adult novel and bounced it to my agent going, I want to do this young adult thing. And it was the longest rip and tear I've ever seen. It was like 3 pages, single space. And one of the ones is, multiple characters are doing the same thing. You should compact them. And what I rewrote, I first rethought the entire process. Took it whole way down to the premise and went from there. And that ended up being the Black Wolves of Boston. But everything changed. The only thing that stayed the same was the werewolves. And some of the names stayed the same. But, it was a huge, and one of the things was, you've got too many characters doing the same thing.
Nick, it looked like you wanted to jump in there.
For my debut, I have 2 characters that actually, my agent and my editor both said, maybe we should just consolidate these 2. And I kind of had to explain, I'm like, they do start very similar. But my goal was, as the series progressed, they went off in completely different ways. And when I was explaining this, they were like, okay, how do they go off? Because my editors, they both want to know, like, why are we having these characters at the very beginning who are very similar, and what do they end up becoming? And when I was able to explain, like, no, they end up on, like, very vastly different things, but it's the story of how they separated that's important. They were okay with it. And another character, they were like, this character's too similar. And I'm like, okay, cool, I'll just consolidate them. It really is. Sometimes I feel like I fight one battle and I'm like, this is important to me. And this other time I'm like, nah, I made a mistake. Let me just consolidate characters.
So we have just 2 minutes left, panelists. Do we want to do just a quick round? If there's one thing that you really wanted to say that you haven't gotten to say yet on the panel, or if it's your opportunity to say, hey, here's my book, or here's where you can find me later on. Julayne,
I wanted to bounce off of what Nick said.
Oh, okay.
You're the writer of the book. You know the story better than anybody else. If you know there's a good logical reason for you've done something, you can stand up and go, no, it's a house of cards, and if you pull that one card, you're going to collapse the whole thing. But you also have to have the non-ego to listen to the person and actually consider if they're right or not. They might not be, but it's a delicate balance. You have to be willing to change, but you have to also stand up for your work.
Yeah. It's been said that editors are often correct that there is a problem and where it is, but wrong about how to solve it. So, Julayne, did you have one last thing you wanted to say in the 30 seconds remaining?
Oh, just that as a writer, the minor character thing, I can't say that I have had anybody tell me that to delete that minor character, but as an editor telling a writer to delete the minor character, or suggesting, I should say, suggesting that that minor character can somehow be redone, then yeah, that has happened a lot.
Kim, do you have one thing you wanted to say as a to bat sweep?
On that regard, I tend to, my one novel so far is about independent interstellar contract insurance investigator. He's sent forth where nobody has an office. So he goes, they contract him to go figure out what's going on. And characters come and go, but generally they appear for him to interrogate. They have some piece of information he needs, and then he moves on to the next point of the investigation, and they disappear from the story.
Mm-hmm.
But for the moment they appear, you know, they're moving the story along.
Do what they need to do. And in fact, we need to be moving the story along because our panel time is over. Thank you all very much, attendees, for coming. Thank you very much, panelists, for being such awesome panelists. And if you are enjoying your virtual Balticon, please don't forget that the Baltimore Science Fiction Society is looking for some donations, and help them out.